Hello and most welcome to 1838 of the Heidegger series. We will today look into a new article, an original article by Francis Y. Lin. And this is the third article we take up with him. The name of this one is The Grammatical Nature of Wittgenstein's Private Language Investigation. Abstract. In this paper I examine the grammatical nature of Wittgenstein's private language argument, PLA for short. On my interpretation, the definition of private language implies that the private speaker has no natural expressions for his sensations. This in turn implies that he has no criterion of correctness for using his sensation words. This then implies, together with the grammatical rule, that a word is senseless without a criterion of correctness for its use. The private sensation words are senseless, and hence also that private language is senseless. So in my analysis, Wittgenstein succeeds in dissolving the problem of private language through a grammatical investigation. And therefore his treatment of private language is consistent with his meta-philosophy. I further explain that Wittgenstein provides a diagnosis of the error of the philosopher who thinks that private language is possible, and that he also offers a therapy. Consisting of analogies or objects of comparison. I also make a comparison with my previous studies on the PLA and discuss a number of novelties in my interpretation. One, introduction. Private language is arguably the most important topic in Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. there are several reasons for this. One is that the so-called private language argument, PLA, is related to a host of other problems, such as phenomenological language, rule following, solipsism, and skepticism. Another reason is that a great many papers and books have been written on private language. A third reason is that understanding the PLA is crucial for understanding Wittgenstein's later philosophy. Let me explain this. As it is known to all Wittgenstein scholars, he only states what everyone admits and makes no hypotheses. His investigation is a grammatical one, whose aim is to show that all philosophical problems should completely disappear. Now, if what Wittgenstein says about philosophy is true, then the PLA should conform to this conception. If the PLA contain any disputable statements, then Wittgenstein would be wrong about his philosophy and would be guilty of bragging. Yet, the fact is that the PLA is full of interpretational disputes. It would be too big a task for the present paper to review all these disputes. But a brief outline of them would help to understand the current situation and motivate the present paper it seems to me that the disputes can be classified in two broad categories. Those concerning the PLA specifically, and those pertaining to Wittgenstein's later philosophy in general. The disputes concerning specifically the PLA include the following. First, disputes over the definition of private language. For example, there's a debate between the so-called community view and individualist view. According to the former, a private language is one spoken by a person in complete isolation, and such a language is impossible. The individualists argue to the contrary, that such a language is possible. But does Wittgenstein really mean such a language by a private language? Second, disputes over the conclusion of the PLA. Many commentators think that for Wittgenstein, private language is impossible. Yet some others for example, the later Baker and Mulhall hold that Wittgenstein's real point is that private language is senseless. Third, disputes over why private language is impossible or senseless. There exists a variety of interpretations in the literature. How to interpret the PLA is often influenced by how to interpret Wittgenstein's later philosophy on the whole. And there are also disputes over how the latter should be done. There is a debate over whether the interpretation of Wittgenstein's later philosophy should be based solely on PI, or it should be done by incorporating texts from his Nachlass. This debate is related to the debate of whether Wittgenstein's later philosophy was stable or whether it went through significant changes. For example, Schulte argues that Wittgenstein's attitude toward philosophical method, which is closely related to grammar, went through significant changes between BT and PI. Whereas Hacker argues that Wittgenstein's conception of philosophy and grammar did not change fundamentally from BT to PI. There are also disputes over how to best interpret Wittgenstein's later philosophy. There are at least 3 readings. One, the so-called theory reading, often attributed to Baker and Hacker. The so-called therapy reading associated with the new Wittgensteinians and the later Baker. 3, the multiple voice reading put forward by Stern. According to the theory reading, Wittgenstein develops and defends theses. For example, about grammar and linguistic rules. In order to dissolve philosophical problems. On the therapy reading, the philosopher gets into trouble because his thoughts are incoherent and inconsistent. He has been held captive by a certain false or misleading picture. Wittgenstein's task is to make the philosopher see and help him untangle the incoherencies and inconsistencies by providing therapies. For example, by providing alternative pictures. On the multiple voice reading, there are 3 voices of the narrator, the interlocutor, and the commentator. Wittgenstein dissolves philosophical problems by means of a dialogue between opposing voices, and the commentator comes closer to expressing Wittgenstein's own viewpoint. Some outtakes here, the private language argument is vitally important. And as we went into before, this is what causes the idea of classical, eternal, permanent laws in the universe, or also to the idea that you can understand something from a sort of outside position, a point from nowhere. But even more interesting here in this context is better understanding Wittgenstein's pedagogy, and that he provides alternative pictures is something I think is very pertinent to know. That by doing that, you understand you did have actually a picture yourself. Like, for example, of you being inside yourself and looking at the world outside of yourself. An alternative picture makes, oh, it could be in a different way. A sort of aha, eureka revelation. But also a slow process where you get used to the alternative picture and they open up new ways. The multiple voice reading is also something worth noting. Even if you don't go as far as Stern, there is a dialogue in PI and some of the others. There's a narrator. We always have the interlocutor, sometimes Frege, sometimes Wittgenstein himself in the form of his earlier self, and the commentator. And the commentator is often the one deemed to be closest to Wittgenstein himself. So there is a sort of trialogue here, and in the trialogue the interlocutor puts out the best possible explanation for the current way things are. So you really get a positive feedback on what you are already thinking. And it's giving a lot of support to the current view. And I think that is important. That will afterwards be undermined. The view of the interlocutor be undermined by the commentator. Not in an evil fashion or an argumentative fashion, but it will show that there is an alternative, and that's about enough actually, usually. Doesn't have to be in that strict way as we usually think. And that's more than enough to soften the whole way up enough. Well, it's a starting point. It looks very interesting. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon, morning, day, or night, wherever you are. Bye bye for now.